Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, August 9. Here's what's on tap this morning. Riots in Britain in this past week posed the gravest challenge to the new Labour government since it took office just 5 weeks ago. In cities around the country, right-wing thugs battled police, attacked and threatened places of refugees where refugees were housed, and hundreds of them now have been arrested and jailed. Why did this happen, and how is Prime Minister Starmer going to get things back under control? Then we look at Bangladesh, where student-led protests turned violent over the weekend, ultimately leading to the ouster of the long-ruling government of Sheikh Hasina. Her iron rule has come to an end. An interim government led by Nobel Economics Prize winning economist Muhammad Yunus was sworn in yesterday. What happened? Why did an autocrat actually leave power? And what can we expect for Bangladesh in the future? And then the Middle East, of course, which has been gripped by fear of an escalating war, as everyone expects Iran and Hezbollah to retaliate for the killings by Israel of leaders in Beirut and Tehran. We're still waiting for that retaliation this morning, and there are growing indications that active U.S. and Arab diplomacy may have persuaded Iran not to act, or at least not to do so in a way that will escalate the war. So what is happening today, and where is this leading in the days and weeks ahead? Here to talk about these stories are three reporters who cover them. One, Anton La Guardia, diplomatic editor of The Economist. David Luhnow, UK bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, and Nahal Toosi, senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Good morning, all three, and good afternoon, David. You're in London, of course. Good to see you today. David, let's start with you. Let's start with these riots out of nowhere. You had a government that was overwhelmingly elected with as you would expect, a honeymoon. And this is a big, big crisis that is engulfing some of the cities particularly up in the north, with large-scale riots and confrontation with the police. What happened, and where do you see this going?
Thanks, Ivo. Thanks for having me. I would say with all social explosions, really with any explosion, you need two things. You need the fuel, something combustible, and you need a spark. I would say in this case, the spark is quite clear. It was the horrific events of July 29, when a 17-year-old deranged teen essentially attacked a children's party with a knife and ended up fatally killing three little girls, ages 6, 7, and 9. I would say, attacks like this can happen anywhere. Probably, fortunately, in Britain, they're usually limited to knives because there is some kind of it's more difficult to get access to, say, a semi-automatic weapon. So sometimes these deranged guys end up with a lower death toll than you might see in places like the U.S., for example. But this, of course, was a horrific killing, and within hours, you had social media essentially putting out misinformation, saying that the assailant was an illegal immigrant who was Muslim and was on an MI6 terror watch list. That information quickly flew around, and soon you had rioting. Some of the ugly scenes that you mentioned, you had a local mosque getting attacked. In the following days, you had hotels where asylum seekers were being housed, being attacked and tried to set on fire. Police were being confronted. So things got pretty ugly. So if that was the spark, I would say that the combustible environment was probably down to three things. One, I would say there has been a record rise in legal migration and a big surge in illegal immigration to the UK over the last few years. This is sort of the background issue. Immigration's been growing for a while. It's been a problem for a while. If you'll remember, the Brexit vote was partly fueled by unease over immigration. But in this case, far from falling, immigration has actually risen. The Conservative government has let in more and more people legally, I might add, to mostly fill gaps in the labor market. But this has made some people uncomfortable. There's also I would say the UK version of the US border problem, Only in this case, it's not people coming over a land border, but far smaller numbers of people coming over in small boats across the English Channel. That also grew. Both of those numbers, legal and illegal, are falling back. But it's created enough of an atmosphere that you had a political party by Nigel Farage, the populist right-winger, get about 15% of the vote during the recent election. So it's clearly an issue that's resonating with some people. Now, I'd say another part of the combustion is a weak UK economy. I mean, if immigration is sort of the right-wing answer for the background of this, I would say the left-wing answer also has a lot of truth to it, and that's deprivation, a lack of services. A lot of these rioters are from marginalized, deprived areas that have not done well. Real wages have not been increasing. So that's part of the problem. People might say they're confusing their own difficult economic circumstances and wrongly blaming migrants for those. But definitely both of those things are happening. And I would say the last one is social media and the weaponization of social media. And this has been a problem, obviously, that we've seen in a lot of places. But in this case, it's been made even worse by, in recent days, Elon Musk, the owner of X, also sort of weighing in, spreading misinformation himself. And so it's sort of created, I think, a lot of attention to the role that social media is playing in situations like this and what one does about it. Now, the government has responded quite forcibly. They've made a lot of arrests, and it's probably no coincidence that Keir Starmer is a former public prosecutor, and his government is very quickly, and I think in a very transparent and public manner, prosecuted a lot of these rioters. So, there's an old British saying that nothing like a good hanging to focus the mind. And I think that has focused minds. So there were supposed to be some large protests planned for Wednesday night. They largely fizzled out. It was also thanks to a lot of ordinary Brits and the Muslim community that took to the streets to sort of take back their towns. So it didn't get broader resonance. But I do think these prosecutions sent a big message. A lot of the British tabloids, for example, I noticed, even right-leaning ones like the Daily Mail and the Sun, made a big deal about really calling out these thugs as far-right thugs, naming and shaming. The Sun's front page on Thursday had 11 mugshots of those who were being prosecuted. So it became clear very quickly that if you did this kind of thing, you were going to end up in jail. Most guys are getting sort of 2 to 3 year sentences. And they're also planning to go after people who are inciting violence online, which I find a sort of particularly interesting part to this whole issue, is how much do you go after people? Where does free speech end? Where does inciting violence begin? And so sort of the social media equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater is calling for violence. So people are being prosecuted for that. And it'll be awfully interesting to see how that plays out.
Fascinating set of issues. I mean, both the social background of this, and then I think the way in which the government is trying to deal with it through the legal mechanisms and the strong police presence, and as you say, this rapid prosecution and sentencing of some of the most significant folks involved, and then the social media piece, which I find fascinating. I guess Mr. Musk is thinking twice about flying to Britain anytime soon, because he may be part of the problem, given all the nonsense that he has been not only spouting but reposting, I guess, or re-Xing. What's the word?
I mean, he shared this one. He shared a tweet from a co-founder of Britain First, a far right group, and it purported to be a story from the Daily Telegraph, saying that the UK government was going to set up essentially a penal colony in the Falklands to take far-right protesters. This was obviously fake, and anybody could have just got on the Daily Telegraph website and checked that it was fake. But Musk shared this, and it got 2 million views before he took it down. So what is the impact of that, and how do governments like the UK and Europe and the US deal with, not only people on social media who are promoting disinformation, but the actual owners of social media promoting disinformation? I mean, I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic and a fascinating thing that Musk has gotten himself into.
Hallie, it was somehow the story rings pretty contemporary even for the United States, because, of course, the appointment or nomination of Governor Walsh of Minnesota, who was responsible for, or at least who was in charge when Minneapolis went up in flames after the George Floyd murder, is now being criticized for not acting quickly enough. So when you look at what's happening in Britain, both in terms of the causes and the way it's dealt with, what lessons do you think that this has for a country like the United States?
I have a bunch of random thoughts. I mean, I think, Walz was criticized in some corners for deploying the National Guard too quickly. Like, people said he shouldn't have. And then there's others who say he didn't deploy it fast enough. So it sort of depends on how you look at it. I was intrigued that the UK story was not a bigger deal in the United States. The State Department kind of was like, free speech is important, but don't act violently. And we're sure the UK has this under control. They seem to have a lot of confidence that the British authorities could handle this. That said, it's not like the Biden administration can, come down in any particularly uniquely distinctive way on this right now. They themselves feel a lot of pressure on the issue of immigration and the border. And so they have to be careful about anything they say, and not just because Joe Biden, wants to think about his legacy, but because he's also thinking about how it will affect Kamala Harris and immigration being a major issue for the 2024 campaign. So it's very delicate here. And at the same time, I do think they probably just had the sense that, like, if we weigh in, it's probably not going to make much of a difference, or at least we probably won't make things any better. I will say I think it's interesting that, there's all this blame on social media about what happened when the British tabloids, some of which are now happily trumpeting, oh, look at these thugs that we, have been arrested and prosecuted, and here are their mugshots. I mean, these are the same tabloids who often have fanned the flames of, much of this division, and we're very keen to highlight things that, were arguably anti-immigrant. I mean, the tabloids there are not necessarily that much more responsible than the social media owners. So, I mean, I think we should be. I just found that somewhat interesting. And I just do want to point out, look, it's really fascinating to me how a lot of times people talk about, when these things happen, they talk about, the economics, and these are people who don't have enough jobs, and yet at the same time it's like, well, they're bringing in immigrants because there's a labor shortage, and there's all these things. And the one thing that a lot of times people don't want to just say is that there's just a lot of racism in many of these places. And that's something that, like every society and every community, Britain still hasn't fully grappled with. And some of its leaders take advantage of it and others don't. And last point, even like the idea of shouting fire in a crowded theater, and how that's not allowed according to it was probably some Supreme Court justice who said it, right? But I just find the character of Nigel Farage really interesting, because he is this kind of right-wing, British politician who has really tried to toe the line on us. Like, he's trying not to be associated with the violent ones, but he's also, been a key part in stoking anti-immigrant views in Britain. And he was a key leader of the Brexit movement, which was partly driven by anti-immigrant sentiment. And so I'm like, well, is Nigel Farage the kind of guy who says there's fire in a crowded theater? Or is he the kind of guy who just stands there and is like, I don't know what's going on, but I think I see some smoke. What could it possibly be? Right? I don't know. So what do you do with the guys and women, I guess, who keep saying there's smoke, but we don't know what it is. We don't have anything to do with it. Maybe we should leave the theater. Maybe we shouldn't. I don't know. We're just raising questions, right? And those are the ones that I think in some ways are more of a challenge to our court systems, our authorities, than the ones who go out there and say, hey, there's fire in this crowded theater.
Yeah, no, interesting. This, and we've had this debate, and we will continue to have this debate, and every country will have this debate about the limits of free speech and the actions that follow from it. Anton, when you look at your home country and what's happening there, how do you how do you see it? And do you think this is a good thing or not? It's not a good thing. Do you think the way that Starmer has handled this will strengthen his political capacity to drive some hard decisions, which you will have, or will this take the sheen off the honeymoon?
I think that it is striking that Britain had this model transition of power where one party won overwhelmingly. The van turns up at Downing Street. One prime minister is nice about the other prime minister. The things are taken away. The new man comes in. A new government is formed within hours, and the country continues to run. And this is the way it's always been done. But the fact that it happens in this current era is striking and heartwarming. And then
at a fraction of the cost, I might add.
At a fraction of the cost, of course. And for these riots to happen sort of seemingly out of the blue, out of a horrible murder, I think has shaken the government and the government's confidence. I think there's a number of things to add to what David and Nahal have said. First of all is, the lack of guns in Britain is a good thing. The second thing is that these riots, the far right, Britain has known summer riots in the past, has known race riots. I don't think there's ever been sort of far right riots of this kind that we have seen, although the National Front and other parties have been active and have caused trouble in the past. But I think the sort of firm policing and the firm prosecution are important. I wouldn't necessarily attribute that to Starmer himself. The Crown Prosecution Service is independent. The police is independent. So let's make sure that these institutions are separate from the political organs. But I think that a lot of these people who've been brought up before the courts, and what's been interesting is that they've been televised. British court proceedings are often not televised, and you have the 69-year-old welder who was absolutely out of control on the day of the riot, now seemingly sort of terribly remorseful about what has happened to him, never been in trouble before. And I think that does speak to the point about the radicalizing force of social media and rumor. I suspect this will die down. Civil society has mobilized relatively quickly. You've had these counter demonstrations that got set up. I've got to say that some of the people on the counter side have also said some very inflammatory things and are now finding themselves up before the courts. The nature of British society has changed. A far smaller proportion than in the past says to be British is essential that you are born in Britain. But I think one of the factors here has been the radicalizing force of immigration on politics on the right, in the Conservative Party, particularly among figures on the right of the party, people like Suella Braverman and so on, and the contest that they are having with Nigel Farage that Nahal mentioned over kind of control of the right of British politics. And I think that is one of the forces that is turbocharging this. And I remember Nigel Farage when he was a sort of quixotic one-man band who was fighting for the pound to make sure that the pound wasn't abolished in favor of the euro. And I remember him coming down to the Justus Lipsius building in Brussels when I was based there, and he said, Anton, the new thing is going to be immigration. And this is the thing we're now going to start focusing on. So, the threat to the pound was abolished, was forgotten, and the threat to British culture from immigration was quite deliberately stoked up and played up through the Brexit debate and then subsequently.
The only thing I would add to all of this is, when I look at Britain and I first came to Britain as a student back in the 1970s, and you see the change in society. The society has changed tremendously, but in a way that I think is admirable, and for most Western countries should be an example in terms of the integration of immigrants, early on, colonial and others. But in the politics, you see, prime ministers and senior ministers of all races, of all kinds, and no one seems to make a big point of it. in contrast to some of the debates that we're still having in the United States and have had for a very long time. And it's an interesting contrast, I think, not only to the U.S., but also continental Europe, where the issue of immigration, but more importantly, the integration and diversification of society still is politically and socially far more significant than in some ways it is in Britain, which is why these riots were somewhat surprising out of nowhere. Speaking of riots, let's switch over, Nahal, to Bangladesh, where there have been periodic upright or disquiet and discomfort with the nature of the government. But here, in a very short period of time, large numbers of people taken to the streets and forcing the government from power, a government that was just overwhelmingly reelected in an election that was probably neither free nor fair, for what is it, the fifth term or fourth term, I guess, just recently. So what happened and what can we expect?
Well, basically, there's been a lot of disquiet with the government of Sheikh Hasina, the longtime prime minister of Bangladesh. And what sparked this latest uprising, I guess you could say, is that it's a debate over this quota system for jobs for college grads. Essentially, there was a system that gave preferences to government jobs for descendants of people who fought in Bangladesh's War of Independence back in the early 70s. And this has basically lingered there for a long time. It's frustrated a lot of Bangladesh's students because there's a very small number of jobs to compete for. And if like 30% of these jobs were reserved for this particular group of people, it just made it even harder for them to get jobs in a place where joblessness is still a major problem. And there's just a lot of inequality and corruption, right? So this was a system that was in place back in 2018. The government, in response to demonstrations, basically shot it down. They were like, all right, we're not going to do this anymore. And then a few months ago, in response to a lawsuit from people who supported the quotas, one of the high courts in the country said, we're going to reinstate the quota system. That sparked all sorts of new demonstrations. And then another high court, I can't remember the same one, said, okay, we're going to keep this system, but we're going to reduce the number involved. But that wasn't enough. And by then, the students had been demonstrating. The government had been cracking down severely. There were reports of 200 people killed. And this is all on top of years and years and years of growing autocracy under Sheikh Hasina, the prime minister, who, says she's a believer in democracy and comes from a system where her father basically helped founded the modern state of Bangladesh and brought democracy, but as is common with many longtime leaders, just can't seem to let go of power. And her government has jailed dissidents, they've jailed opposition leaders, they've jailed artists. There's just been so many problems. So basically, over time, this riots or demonstrations over quotas became demands that she had to go because her government had been killing people on the streets, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And eventually, a few days ago, earlier this week, I believe, she said, okay, I'm leaving. She flees to India, she resigns, and now Bangladesh's army briefly took control, and they brought in a caretaker prime minister, Muhammad Yunus, who was one of the people who is, the founder of Grameen Bank, a Nobel winner, and is one of the people that her government had been actually targeting. So there's a caretaker government now, and we're going to see what happens. A few things to keep in mind about Bangladesh is there's a lot of interesting stuff. It's a very, very densely populated country. It has done extremely well in recent years. I mean, it's made a lot of progress on a lot of levels, poverty levels going down, things like that. But there's still a lot of inequality, a lot of corruption. Having been there, I can tell you literally the environment, like the air is difficult to breathe. There's a lot of issues that the government has been unable to solve. And Sheikh Hasina has just been unwilling to let go of power to the point where a few years ago, when the Biden administration held its summits for democracy, they did not invite Bangladesh because they were unhappy with what she had done. Now, she is, I believe, the longest serving female head of government. So that was an accomplishment. But I met her about, I think it was like a year and a half ago. And I asked her, I was interviewing her, and I asked her if she still believed in democracy. And she just looked at me like I was crazy. And she kind of started dancing around. And finally, she was like, of course, I believe, and then she keeps talking about how she's done this amazing job as a leader, and how much progress there'd been under Bangladesh. But I would point out things like, look, you're imprisoning all these people. You're doing these things that seem very anti-democratic. Do you still believe? And will you step down if you actually lose? And she insisted that, of course, if the people stop wanting me, I will leave. Now, of course, then she effectively rigged an election. But it seems like now the people have made their choice clear, and she has left. But weirdly enough, she's in her late 70s. I asked her at some point, I was like, look, why don't you just retire? Like, have you thought about just retiring? And she shot back at me, well, would you ask Joe Biden if he would retire? And I was like, yeah, I would. If I had a chance, I would ask him. But she and her people kind of have came to kind of believe that she was the only one who could really lead Bangladesh into the future. And so, is there a comeback in her future? I mean, it literally could come down. I wouldn't be surprised if she tried to come back in some way. I don't know if she could pull it off. And the last thing I will say is Bangladesh, her family history is actually really fascinating. Her father, like I said, have founded the country's modern state. Her father and her mom and most of her family was killed in, I believe it was an army coup. This is a country with a history of military intervention. It's unstable, and I would not say it's out of the woods yet. We do not know what's going to happen, but it's important to watch, in part because it is in a region where there's constant worries about everything from Islamist extremism to environmental issues, climate change, things like that. And so it is really important to watch Bangladesh and see what happens.
Great, that's terrific, David. Yeah, before we went on the air, you talked about an article you wrote last year, I believe, about autocrats not leaving power. And by the way, if we look at another election that was supposed to lead to a change in government in Venezuela just a few weeks ago, a country extraordinarily well, having reported from Latin America for so many years, here a leader is leaving. And I guess when they leave, it becomes pretty darn hard to come back. Although in other places, they're trying to.
Yeah, it really struck me how countercurrent the Bangladesh situation was. I mean, I wrote that essay during the Prigozhin Wagner rebellion against Putin. And my point, the reason I thought of doing it is because I was talking with my colleagues here at the Wall Street Journal, and some were sort of expressing hope that this might actually lead to a change in Russia. And I said, you're crazy. Once an autocrat like Putin is in, an incident like this might actually help him because he'll see who's not with him in the armed forces and elsewhere. He'll root them out. Those that stay will get rewarded, and he'll be stronger than ever. So he's not going anywhere. And I had said that only because of my experience in Latin America, watching Chavez and then Maduro, watching Ortega come to power again in Nicaragua. It seems like nowadays, particularly in Latin America, of course, the old playbook, you do that and you might get Uncle Sam, if it was in Uncle Sam's interest, to come kick you out of power. Thinking of Noriega and various other situations, of course. But nowadays that's kind of off the table. I mean, ever since Iraq, obviously the U.S. isn't going to go around invading countries anymore. So a lot of these autocrats, particularly in Latin America, where the U.S. felt it had more of a right to intervene, can stay. And I think the lesson they've learned is that as long as you repress your people hard enough, you get to stay. Certainly that's what Ortega's done. Certainly it's what Maduro's done, the Cuban regime as well. I think Putin has the theocrats in Iran. So the list is long. Syria. And then, of course, they all sort of share tips and sort of the latest means on how to do this. Everything from, control of social media to targeted control of dissidents to jailing, selective torture, expelling large groups of people who aren't happy. I mean, Venezuela's had 8 million people leave the country, sadly, in the last few years. So, you get rid of the unhappy ones, and then it creates this sort of weird situation where they then send billions in remittances back to the country. And in a way, it's sort of their business model. It keeps their country going. They get rid of the unhappy people, but get a new stream of income. And so it's a very stable situation in many ways. And particularly when these autocracies get more and more entrenched and cooperate. So dislodging that seems, no one really knows how to dislodge it. We try sanctions, but sanctions for regime change don't have a very good record. They obviously signal that you're not happy. They may hurt, but in terms of actually leading to regime change, the evidence is pretty thin. I just find it interesting with Bangladesh. How that happened, and whether it's an example that breaks the trend, is the fact that she was a woman make any difference? I don't know, but I find that interesting. There are not so many female dictators sometimes as there are male dictators, but that may be a wrong interpretation of the data or selective interpretation of the data.
The only other woman that I can think of that comes close is actually Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, right? She's his vice president.
She's a piece of work.
Very much, a couple in power. And
that's true.
She doesn't seem willing to let go like Sheikh Hasina does. So I think we need a larger data set, right? We just need more women to figure out what they would do.
Unlike fine wines, dictators and autocrats don't improve with time. And tend to get worse, particularly as they get older. But I think one of the things that's one of the variables in Nahal's bigger data set should be the question of whether the army is willing to shoot. It often comes down to that. In Bangladesh, the army said, we're going to stop shooting people. We're not going to do this anymore. Mubarak fell because the army turned against them, or decided to preserve its power by sacrificing Mubarak and trying to manage a transition before it could regain power itself. And in a lot of these cases, the army is willing to continue to shoot. And so the regime stays in power when all the other tricks of the trade that David was talking about fail them. So I think that's something certainly to look to add to the mix. The Shah of Iran, for example, fell when the army decided to stop shooting people.
That's right, Anton, and that's the only hope left in Venezuela is that somehow the lower-ranking members of the army will decide that this time around they've had it too, that their pay is not good enough, their prospects aren't good enough, that they're not going to do that. They've been very efficient about sort of deploying the National Guard and making them do the repression, not having to call on the army. But of course, you say to the army. U.S. tried once to try to get them to turn; it didn't work. This time around, we'll see what happens. I'm pessimistic, but probably only because I'm biased because of my recent experience.
Well, I mean, I think the record is a good reason to be pessimistic, even though in this case of Bangladesh in particular, and I think, Anton, you're absolutely right. The army and security forces and how they act is critical, which is one of the reasons autocrats tend to create their own forces and militias.
The guys with guns, exactly. A lot of paramilitaries in Venezuela.
Which is, by the way, what Putin did by creating the National Guard, loyal to him and no one else.
Just to give you all a little bit of hope in life, may I indulge? Will you indulge me in citing the Economist op-ed piece by Muhammad Yunus, which has just appeared before he was named president? The gobsmacking, one of the gobsmacking lines in it, he says, "No Bangladeshi younger than 30 has ever cast a vote in an unrigged national election in Bangladesh." And I think that is also another variable in this, which is when elections, dictators that try to legitimize themselves through elections run a risk when those elections go wrong. And I was in the Philippines in '86 when Marcos, father of the current president, tried to stay in power with an election, and that went badly wrong for him. And the people and then the army turned against him. Muhammad Yunus has 190 court cases pending against him. And he says he thanks human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and the George Clooney Foundation, saying they've been especially helpful. So when you think that advocating for human rights is totally pointless and a drop in the ocean, people like Muhammad Yunus will tell you it does make a difference.
Well, let's talk in like 5 years, right? And we'll see whether the military is in charge in Bangladesh or Sheikh Hasina's son somehow comes and like stages a comeback. I mean, let's withhold judgment for a while.
Well, let's enjoy the moment.
Yeah, I mean, and it is. I mean, just as autocrats have particular ways of staying in power, there are, history is replete with extraordinary individuals doing extraordinary things, and Yunus seems to be one of those people that can mobilize a large number of folks to do, to move in the right direction. He may not be Nelson Mandela, but there are people in history who've been able to do this. And Yunus is a truly remarkable human being in so many different ways, and he's done so much for so many through his microfinancing work and everything else, which has been a pillar of economic development strategy for the last 50 years or so. And for those individuals who have benefited from this, they've benefited from greatly, and the totality of it adds up to millions, hundreds of millions of people. So hopefully that can be translated into something very positive for society there. Speaking of leaders who can mobilize their societies, the Middle East is one of those places where it's not about good leaders. It tends to be about a whole bunch of bad leaders, Anton. And we see we've watched a week in which I think everyone woke up in the morning to make, at least in the United States, to say, okay, did anything happen? And nothing happened. What do you expect? How do you see the last week, when I think everyone expected a very major retaliation by the Iranians and Hezbollah because of the assassinations in Beirut and Tehran, and so far, not much.
So who knows? It may yet happen. And the feeling is still that something probably will happen, but you do have this, this fake war. Well, I mean, it's not a fake war because there's war actually happening, but, the sort of fake regional war that, everyone's expecting something terrible to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. I think part of that has to do with the, first of all, the political transition in Tehran. You've got a new president who seems to be more of a reformer and moderate. So who knows what's happening under the carpet, the very expensive Persian rug in Tehran with everybody fighting each other, as they always do. And the other thing that seems to be happening is that America is running a very intense diplomatic campaign through Arab countries and through Islamic countries to try and speak to the Iranians and say, look, don't do this because you will have one of two impacts. At the very least, you will endanger the prospect of a ceasefire, which the Americans and the Qataris and the Egyptians keep saying is close. The Iranians may or may not care about a ceasefire, depending on which faction you belong to. But one has to assume some of them don't want this to go on forever because it raises the risk of escalation to them. And the other danger, of course, is that these separate wars that you've had for 10 months in Gaza, this sort of more limited but ever intensifying fire across the border with Lebanon, and then the shooting by Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and by the Houthis in Yemen, who have interrupted much of the shipping in the Red Sea, could sort of merge and become one big regional war. And, one of the forms of retaliation that may happen is that instead of having a direct attack from Iran to Israel, as you had in April, which was largely parried by the United States working with France, Britain, Arab countries, and ultimately Israel's own layered defenses, you could have the combination of fire from Iran and from perhaps Hezbollah, which I think would be harder to stop because of the multiple trajectories and the greater number of weight of fire, and the fact that from Lebanon they're firing at shorter range, and therefore it's harder to intercept stuff. So who knows what the calculations are? Iran will want to show that it has deterrent power, but it will be trying to calibrate how to do this. We think they still don't want a regional conflagration, and probably Hezbollah doesn't want either. In this mess, the Americans have tried to insert a fire break, which is to call the parties to the ceasefire to negotiations on Thursday, and together with the Egyptians and Qataris say they're willing to table what they call final bridging proposals. The problem, of course, is that the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh means that Hamas doesn't have a chief negotiator. His political role has gone to Yahya Sinwar, the political leader in Gaza, who is the mastermind of the October 7th attacks on Israel. He's not the guy who's going to turn up at the negotiations because he's been hiding in tunnels for the past 10 months, but remains the ultimate decision maker. So one question is, who will be sent to talk? And the question is, does the assassination change Sinwar's calculations? All of which puts the Americans in a very odd diplomatic position. On the one hand, they're utterly furious at Benjamin Netanyahu for doing this attack at the kind of wrong time because of all the consequences that might flow from it, yet having to say and mean that it will defend Israel if it is attacked by either Iran or Hezbollah. And a lot of American hardware has gone into the Middle East to try and tamp down on any potential retaliation. And the other delicate balancing act the Americans have to perform is to tell the Iranians terrible things are going to happen if you retaliate, yet trying to prevent those terrible things from happening behind the scenes with the Israelis trying to hold them back. So we'll see how it plays out. Thursday will be an important date. The Americans are already busy telling us that that is not when a ceasefire deal and hostage and prisoner exchange will be negotiated, but it will be an important time, and we hope that the current breathing space that for some reason has held will continue into another week. I think we're in the business of every day that something bad doesn't happen is good.
Well, that's usually the case. No news is good news in that sense. Nahal, you spent a lot of time reporting on this set of issues. Anything to add to Anton? Do you see it the same way, or how do you look at it?
Yeah, I mean, look, there was an English account attributed to Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and it said maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a week. And it's it's something that people are reacting to it, honestly, kind of humorously, being like, what do you think, this is a Tinder date or whatever? I mean, but the reality is we don't know exactly when and how the Iranians and Hezbollah are going to react. I certainly think they will somehow. I think it would be foolish to think that there will be no reaction. I have one of the things I'm struggling with is this leak that the U.S. has put out there saying, oh, well, you know what? We told the Iranians that if they do something, the retaliation will be devastating to their economy. And it's like, what are you like? How much more devastating do you think their economy is going to get? I mean, they already are under tremendous amounts of sanctions. They found ways around them. So I'm not sure that that's a message that necessarily works on the Iranians, even though the U.S. is going around telling people, hey, we think they're recalibrating because we told them this, because we told them that any reaction will be devastating. And it's like, well, I mean, do you think the Iranians don't think that? And I will just say, I think one of the most fascinating things about all of this is it really shows how little leverage the U.S. has over Israel. People think that the U.S. has this magic wand sometimes, and we could just tell a country like Israel, do this, do that. And even I really think even if the U.S. were to stop a lot of the weapons or whatever that we give to Israel, the Israelis are going to do what they believe is in their self-interest. And then add to that, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to do what he believes is in his interest. And, there's often this kind of amnesia sometimes when discussing these Iranian attacks. A lot of people, for instance, when they talk about what happened in mid-April, they are just like, Iran attacked Israel, but they keep forgetting that Israel actually was the one who originally provoked Iran by attacking Iranian military leaders in what Iran said was a diplomatic facility in Syria. And so this time around, Israel did carry out, we believe, an attack in Tehran. And so the idea that Iran won't react or that Hezbollah won't do something, it's, I don't know. I find that hard to believe. The question, again, comes down to what and when. And again, if Hassan Nasrallah is like, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, I guess we'll see. And then the question really becomes, how will Israel react to that? And that's where I think the risk of escalation really lies.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's the tit for tat that is the issue, David. In a minute or so that we have left, how do the Europeans look at this? The British government is a different government. It's been more critical of Israel than its predecessor. And how worried are they, and what are they trying to do to mitigate the consequences? Of course, Britain still has diplomatic relations with Iran, so there is a conversation that can be had there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anton probably knows more than I do about this, but I'm sure they're concerned about it. I think everybody's worried about this, regional war breaking out. It feels like all the incentives keep tilting in the wrong directions in terms of everybody escalating. More than insights, I'm left with everybody else with questions. I mean, well, how does Iran retaliate? How does Israel then respond to that? And can the U.S., as has been pointed out, have any kind of leverage? Seems to me Iran has to retaliate. The last time they did it, it was almost symbolic in the sense that, yes, it was the first direct attack, but nothing happened. All of these things were shot down. What else is in their playbook that they can go to? Not just relying on their proxies to actually send a message to Israel. And what does that look like? I'd be curious.
Well, that's what we're going to be looking for. And if we see an escalation, we'll be back next week to talk about it. Hopefully there won't be, in which case we'll be talking about the ceasefire negotiations next Thursday that Anton mentioned. I want to thank Anton La Guardia of The Economist, Nahal Toosi of Politico, and David Luhnow of the Wall Street Journal for fantastic insights on this week's story. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and we will be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.